CompTIA Security Plus SY0-701 exam information is today's topic. My name's David Staples, and that's coming right up. So one of the most common questions I get when I'm teaching a certification-related class is what can I expect to see on the exam? So this video is specifically about the objectives document that CompTIA has made public that talks about here's the things that you could expect to see potentially on your exam. Be sure to stay tuned to the end. There is a tip that I'm going to share with you guys at the very end of this video, as well as I'll also share some other smaller tips kind of as we're going through here. But if you're looking for practice questions, this is not that video. I do have another video with some sample practice questions. That link is going to be in the description down below, so be sure to check that out. I've also got a course on Udemy with a bunch of practice questions there, so be sure to check out that one as well. But again, this video is just talking about what is the structure of the exam, what are the objectives that CompTIA is saying that you might see on that exam. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to first dive into the kind of high-level overview of what you can expect for the exam. So the SY0-701 is going to be a maximum of 90 questions. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get 90. You could get 83, you could get 81, you could get 72. It's just basically saying a maximum 90 questions. They've got a rather large question bank, and they're going to randomly choose a set of questions for you to take there. Now these questions are multiple choice and performance based. So multiple choice, hopefully everyone's familiar with, A, B, C, and D, or maybe A, B, C, D, E. That's essentially one of the question types and the most common question type that you're going to have on the exam. But typically those are going to come after what we call some performance based questions, where you might have some drag and drops where it might show you a diagram and you're going to have to put certain things like an IDS or an IPS or next generation firewall or web application firewall into different parts of the network to show that you at least know where these different devices should go as far as that network infrastructure diagram here. Or you might also have other types of performance-based questions as well. So again, I can't tell you exactly what you're going to see because that's not exactly ethical for me to just give you the exam right now, right? So those are the types of things that you could see though. You're going to have to prove some knowledge either at a command line or drag and drop or doing something in a performance-based question. The length of the test is up to 90 minutes, so be sure that you're pacing yourself as you're taking the exam. I have seen students come back after taking the exam say, I ran out of time. So make sure that you're not spending way too much time on that performance-based question where you don't have enough time for the multiple choice coming after that. Performance-based questions are important, but make sure that you pace yourself as you're going through here. Recommended experience, CompTIA recommends a minimum of 2 years experience in IT administration with a focus on security, hands-on experience with technical information security, and broad knowledge of security concepts. So if you do not have much experience in the IT world, if you're brand new to technology, you might want to consider something like the A+ or the Network Plus first, and then work your way up to the Security Plus, because this is definitely a somewhat difficult exam for those who are fairly new in the technology field. So let's go ahead and move on down to the exam objectives as far as the big overall domains. There are 5 domains in the SY0-701 exam. So domain 1.0 is the general security concepts. It's only 12% of the exam. But that's not to say that it's not important. We'll go into the details as far as the individual subdomains for each of these here in just a moment, by the way. But domain 2.0 is threats, vulnerabilities, and mitigations. That is 22% of your exam. Domain 3.0 is security architecture at 18%. Domain 4.0 is security operations. This is a whopping 28% of your exam. And then the last one, that's certainly not least, domain 5.0, security program management and oversight. That is also 1/5 or 20% of your exam. So let's go ahead and get into the details as far as the subdomains here. So starting off with domain 1.0, general security concepts, this is where we're basically going to start off into looking at different types of controls. Is it a technical control or an operational control or a physical control, a managerial control, and what do each of those things mean? We also are then going to look at other ways of categorizing these different control types with things like preventative controls, or is it a detective control or a corrective control? So make sure that you are familiar with all these various different control types for domain 1.1. For domain 1.2, we start into the CIA triad. This is our confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Definitely something that's very big in the IT security world or cybersecurity world. We also get into non-repudiation. The AAA technology is going to come into play here with our authentication and authorization and accounting capabilities here built into our AAA systems. We'll get into things like zero trust. Zero trust is a big buzzword in the IT world right now, so make sure that you're familiar with zero trust. We especially talk about it in the cloud world. As far as our physical security goes, I know a lot of people don't necessarily think about physical security as being an IT kind of thing, right? But we need to make sure that we're protecting those data systems, and some of those physical systems are going to be network connected, right? Such as when you go to badge into a building. Most corporate Fortune 500 buildings these days, you're going to have a little badge. That badge reader is connected to a network. And that network is going to connect it to a centralized system that's going to say, yes, this person is authorized to enter this particular location and into this particular building, into this particular room, whatever that might be. We also got security cameras a lot of these days are IP cameras. So those are also going to be connected to the network. But we still look at things like fencing, K-rated fencing, preventing vehicles driving through. We talk about security guards. We talk about motion detection. There's all sorts of things that are physical security that we'll talk about as part of the Security Plus exam. Then we get into things like deception and disruption technologies. So we'll talk about things like honey nets, honey pots, honey files, and honey tokens. But moving on to subdomain 1.3, we're then going to get into things like business processes, where we'll talk about who owns and who is responsible for these particular processes within the organization. We'll also talk about things like stakeholders. So if you have a background in project management, this will probably come a little easier to you. We do also have another section later on, another subdomain, if you will, that the subdomain is going to much more focus on things like risk tolerance and risk management. But under 1.3, we're also going to look at things like allow and deny lists. You'll see that again later. And of course, we certainly want to make sure that we're talking about documentation pretty much at every step of the way here, whether it is documenting new systems as we're deploying them or documenting something as we are fixing it, so that somebody else can come back behind us later if, for whatever reason, what we did not fix something, or if we leave the organization and we've configured something and it's worked great for 2 years, but now somebody needs to make a modification to it, they at least have the information that they need. I know I've certainly gone into jobs where we don't have any documentation. That's really going to be one of your first tasks, actually, by the way. You're now a technical writer. Congratulations. So it's always fun going in somewhere where you don't have any documentation and you have to now basically write everything in addition to all the other tasks that you need to do day to day, right? Maybe not so much. So make sure you're documenting things as you go along. Your peers, your coworkers will certainly thank you for it. And you might thank yourself for it if you have to go a couple of years and don't work on a certain thing and have to go back to it, right? So going to subdomain 1.4, PKI is another topic that we're going to talk about. Public keys and private keys being an asymmetric encryption type. We'll also get into symmetric encryption when we're talking about the Security Plus. In addition to the two-way encryption, we'll also talk about one-way encryption, which is hashing. And we'll talk about the differences between hashing and encryption, kind of what that really means, as well as how it works with digital signatures, where we might use both encryption as well as hashing combined together. We'll talk about other technologies such as trusted platform modules and hardware security modules. Those are certainly going to be important. We'll get into things like obfuscation, where we talk about steganography. We're going to get into salting. We'll talk about certificate revocation lists, OCSP, the Online Certificate Status Protocol. Both of those are used to make sure that our certificates are still valid for when we go to a site that's using HTTPS. So we'll get into all sorts of certificate-based terms and technologies here, which, by the way, while I'm talking about terms and some of these acronyms, make sure you know all the TLAs that are at the end of this document. If you're not familiar with the term TLA, three-letter acronym. We'll just say that it's a running joke within IT that we've got a lot of TLAs. It's not one that you need to know for the exam, though. But moving on to domain 2.0, threats, vulnerabilities, and mitigations. 2.1, subdomain 2.1, compare and contrast common threat actors and motivations. So here we're going to be talking about the various different threats to your organization. Are they going to be hacktivists? Are they nation states? Are they insider threats or organized crime? So there's a lot of different threats to our potential organizations. Some of these may not necessarily be intentional threats. Some of these may just be unintentional or natural causes, things like tornadoes and hurricanes and tsunamis and whatnot. We need to make sure that we're protecting against those types of things as well. They are still a threat to the organization if we don't plan for it. And while we're talking about some of these different disasters and everything that could happen, there's a great quote that I'm reminded of by a guy named Werner Vogels. He's the Chief Technology Officer and VP at Amazon.com. The quote is that everything fails all the time. So it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's a natural disaster or whether it is a power supply fan has failed or a hard drive has failed or a piece of memory has failed. In technology, we know that things fail sometimes, and it's not due to necessarily the quality of the hardware. It's just that it only really has a certain lifespan, right? So we know that things go down, fiber gets cut by a construction crew, or a big truck hits a telephone pole and now fiber's all over the street. Things fail. So we need to plan for those failures. So make sure that we're actually thinking about disaster recovery. How do we fail over to perhaps another location? So we'll get into that here in just a little bit as well. But when it comes to these various different types of threats, make sure that you consider all the different types of threats out there and perhaps some of the different motivations that some of those different threats may have. If it's someone like a hacktivist, it might be that they just don't like our organization and they want to make sure that people can't use our applications or that we can't use our applications. Or sometimes there's a monetary motivation as well. If they steal all of our data, then they can resell it, or they can use those credit card numbers to perhaps go commit some credit card fraud or something along those lines, right? So domain 2.2, we're going to look at explaining common threat vectors and attack surfaces. So how are people going to try and manipulate our companies, employees, for doing things like social engineering with vishing or phishing or farming or smishing? There's all sorts of different things that we talk about as far as social engineering. Typically, we look at human beings as being the weakest link to the organization's security, because human beings can easily be manipulated a lot of times, where they will give us access to certain areas that we shouldn't have access to, or they'll give us their password over the telephone if we call and we're pretending that we're the IT department. And that's where we get into things like penetration testing, where you can test for those types of scenarios later on. But as far as those attack vectors, make sure that you're aware of all the different ways that different data can come into the organization and potentially spread a virus around, or potentially social engineering vectors such as email and text message and telephone calls and whatever else. So let's go ahead and scroll on down to domain 2.3 or subdomain 2.3. Explain various different types of vulnerabilities. We know that we have vulnerabilities in both hardware and software, and there are different ways that we can implement into our custom applications as well as those hardware devices to make sure that people are not exploiting certain types of vulnerabilities there, such as making sure that when we're using this structured query language, that we're preventing against injection by doing input validation, making sure that we're protecting against things like cross-site scripting, making sure that we're updating firmware for various different devices, at least occasionally, because sometimes there are new vulnerabilities discovered in firmware that devices are released with, and so they release updates at least every so often. We'll go ahead and move into subdomain 2.4, given a scenario, analyze indicators of malicious activity. Here we'll talk about various different types of malware, such as ransomware, trojans, worms, spyware, and so on. There's a lot of different types of malware that you need to be familiar with, which means that you also need to be familiar with how we actually protect against those or stop those. We'll talk about a variety of different types of attacks, such as password attacks, and which means that we also need to talk about how to create secure passwords as well. We'll also talk about other ways that we can secure the individual accounts in an organization, such as if someone tries to log in 5 times and they've gotten the password wrong all 5 of those times, maybe we just need to lock the account so that they can't just continue brute forcing that password over and over and over until they figure out the right combination, right? So moving on into subdomain 2.5, explain the purpose of mitigation techniques used to secure the enterprise. Here's where we'll be talking about things like monitoring and observation. We'll talk about other hardening techniques, such as maybe even using a host-based intrusion prevention system, or HIPS as we might call it, disabling the things that we're not using, such as disabling the port that someone could potentially telnet in on, because we should be using SSH instead. So we'll talk about the secure options versus the insecure options for that. Something that I certainly want to make sure that I point out here, make sure that you are using the principle of least privilege, hopefully familiar with that through a class, talking about that people should only have the access that they need to do their job and nothing more. So if somebody only needs read access to a certain system, we should only be giving them read access, not read and write and create and delete and all these other permissions. We also want to make sure that all of our various different systems are patched as well. There are new patches and hotfixes released on a regular basis, right? So again, I'm trying not to get into teaching mode here. We're just simply talking about these objectives and what you can expect to see on the exam. If you want some practice questions, as I mentioned, check out the description for the video. If you're interested in classes, certainly feel free to reach out. I'm happy to provide a quote for you for doing a class for your organization or for a group of people. But let's go ahead and keep on moving with these objectives. Domain 3.0, security architecture. We want to compare and contrast security implications of different architecture models. So we'll talk about things like the cloud. So if you didn't think that the security exams were going to extend into the cloud, that was just on premises, well, no. As you look at these different organizations that are operating a hybrid environment where they have certain resources on premises and other resources out on the cloud, or a lot of organizations are going 100% cloud, what we call all-in, where they're basically just deploying all of their new infrastructure to the cloud and they're migrating existing on-premises to the cloud where possible as well. So we need to make sure that we understand how to secure those resources in the cloud, as well as to make sure that resources can communicate with each other still. We'll get into some other types of technologies that are going to be specific to on-premises, such as SCADA, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems. They're typically used in an industrial setting, such as industrial control systems and whatnot. We'll also talk a bit about SDN, software-defined networking, that has become more and more popular and more common over the years. From there, we'll move on into subdomain 3.2, given a scenario, apply security principles to secure enterprise infrastructure. And so here we're going to be talking about a variety of different concepts from VPNs and TLS, maybe using certain types of tunneling for VPN connections. We'll get into talking about IPsec, SD-WANs, the software-defined wide area networks. We'll talk about different controls that we can use there. We'll also talk about things like maybe jump boxes. They mentioned jump servers here, also known as a bastion host. We'll talk about proxy servers, intrusion prevention systems, and detection systems. We'll look at load balancers, and we'll also talk about load balancers in another subdomain as well, along with clusters. But there's a lot of different types of principles that you'll want to be familiar with as far as 3.2. In 3.3, we get into different classifications of data. Remember I mentioned earlier that mandatory access control is something confidential, is it secret, top secret. There's various different levels that somebody may have assigned to them that they may or may not have access to different resources based on that, and we may classify our data, so we'll talk about data classification there. We'll also get into different states of data. Data in transit moving across a network versus data at rest where it's being stored on a hard drive versus data in use when it's in a CPU or in memory. So we'll talk about how do we protect those different types of data, or is it possible to protect certain types of data? We'll also look at different methods that we can use to secure data based upon perhaps geography. We might have to secure data in different ways depending upon the political laws that may exist in certain geographical regions. We'll talk about different types of encryption and hashing again there, and obfuscation. As you can see, there is some repetition for some of these individual topics within the various different domains. Moving into domain 3.4, explain the importance of resilience and recovery in security architecture. Again, we mentioned we'll get into load balancing and clustering in another modules, in another subdomain, so here's where you'll see that. We'll talk about testing some of these various different processes that we put into place. We don't want to wait until that hurricane has taken out our power to find out that our systems aren't going to fail over to the alternate location correctly, right? We want to make sure that we test these processes either in a tabletop exercise where we sit there in a conference room and talk about who's responsible for what, or actually kind of more game day exercises where we actually go unplug things and make sure that things are failing over and still working correctly. Some of your classes might talk about certain tools like Chaos Monkey or Chaos Gorilla. So make sure that you're familiar with the various different types of disaster recovery. Certainly very important, looking at UPS systems with battery backups and generators and all sorts of fun tools there. But as I mentioned earlier, everything fails all the time. You never know when the system's going to fail because of natural disaster or an attack or even just fiber being cut by a construction crew right down the road. So let's go ahead and keep on moving here to domain 4.0. 4.0 is security operations. Given a scenario, apply common security techniques to computing resource. This is domain 4.1. Here's where we're going to maybe establish certain baselines. What can we expect so that we can very easily look back in time and see, okay, well, how was this performing 6 months ago or a year ago? Because I don't know if what I'm looking at today is good or bad if I don't know what it was 6 months or a year ago. Am I using more capacity? Am I using less capacity? How's it operating? We also want to look at hardening various different targets, whether we're talking about our individual servers, mobile devices, workstations. There's actually a great quote that's been around for quite some time in the cybersecurity world that says, if you can touch it, you can own it. I've got another video on how to compromise a VMware ESXi server that, so long as I had physical access to it, I could get root access and do anything on that server that I wanted to. So make sure that we're securing things physically as well, right? We'll also get into some of the mobile device technology as well, talking about mobile device management and different policies that you might see at different organizations, from corporate-owned, personally enabled, to bring your own device and what kind of problems those can entail. Some of us joke around that instead of bring your own device, maybe it's bring your own disaster because of all the problems that it can cause. But again, we'll talk about those in the Security Plus classes, so make sure that you're familiar with those various different concepts. Of course, wireless is another area. It's a vector of attack that an attacker can take advantage of, so we'll talk about the newer WPA3. I know the older materials went through WPA2, so that's one of the advantages of using these newer materials, but keep in mind that a lot of things for, even back to the Security Plus, 301, 401, 501, 601, a lot of that stuff is still relevant because things like encryption and hashing, the way that those work haven't really changed as much. There's new algorithms that come out that are more secure, but you can still certainly use some of the older materials for preparing for this exam as well. But again, you'll notice that AAA is mentioned again here, as well as Radius. Radius is your remote authentication dial-in user service, so we'll talk about how that might be used with certain systems. Moving on into 4.2, subdomain 4.2 is explain the security implications of proper hardware, software, and data asset management. Everything has a life cycle to it. Hard drives don't last forever. So when we need to destroy a hard drive, how do you destruct it? Do you just simply wipe it clean, just delete the files and throw it in the trash can? Not really a good option. There are certain ways that we can recover files that have been deleted from hard drives a lot of times. So make sure that you're doing make sure that if you have any sort of critical data on that hard drive whatsoever, or if it has ever contained critical data, that you are destroying that in a much more destructive manner, whether you're running it through a drive shredder or whatever the case may be. But again, trying not to get into teaching mode here. So moving on, we'll talk about domain 4.3 is explain various activities associated with vulnerability management. We'll talk about things like vulnerability scans and sources of where we can find a list of various different threats, such as different threat intelligence feeds. We'll talk about things like CVEs, the common vulnerabilities and exposures. Here they've got it listed as the common vulnerability enumeration. Out in the wild, I typically see it as common vulnerability and exposures. We'll also talk about the CVSS, the common vulnerability scoring system, along those same lines. Again, we're also going to continue hammering on you need to make sure that you're patching and updating your various different systems and applications. Moving into subdomain 4.4, we look at explaining security, alerting, and monitoring concepts and tools with everything from SIEM systems, the security information and event management, to DLP or data loss prevention systems, or SNMP systems, the simple network management protocol systems. So there's a lot of different tools that you can use to monitor and observe the various different resources in your organization. So remember that this is the 28% domain here, so there's going to be a few more subdomains here. So subdomain 4.5, given a scenario, modify enterprise capabilities to enhance security. So here's where we're going to look at examples of what firewall rules look like and access lists. Make sure that you know your ports and protocols. This is one where I've had some students come back and say, well, you said that we needed to know ports and protocol numbers, but I didn't see a single one on my exam. But I've had other people come back and say, yeah, I needed it for like 3 or 4 questions. So thank you for making me do that, because otherwise I would have missed 3 or 4 questions just because I didn't know, SSH ran on port 22 or the HTTPS was port 443. Those are the types of things you need to know, because remember that CompTIA has had this exam around for a really long time. So they have a huge question bank to be able to draw from. As I mentioned, some of these things don't change over time, so they can draw from any number of different concepts here. We'll talk about IPS and IDS systems, again, more with data loss prevention systems, network access control, email security. Email security is a big one right now. A lot of systems are implementing something known as DMARC. This is our domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance, that if a sender is not verified or the domain is not verified, then it will reject the email. So you want to make sure that you're using DMARC correctly here with your organization's email. Moving into subdomain 4.6, given a scenario, implement and maintain identity and access management. So we'll talk about things like onboarding and offboarding of employees, making sure that when someone leaves the organization that they've returned all of the smartphones, laptops, whatever other technology might contain our company's data back to the organization. We'll also talk about different things with multi-factor authentication and what a factor of authentication is, with the something you know, something you have, something you are, and what multi-factor authentication is. Again, we'll get more into what a secure password is and how we can make sure that if we're still using passwords and passphrases, that we're being as secure as we possibly can in that environment. We'll also get a bit into federation of identities, looking at things like single sign-on and what that can do for the organization. Moving on into subdomain 4.7, we want to look at explaining the importance of automation and orchestration related to secure operations. So this is something we certainly talk about in the cloud classes that I teach quite a bit, whether we're talking about Kubernetes or other types of orchestration where when we look at automating things, I said earlier with social engineering that humans are typically the weakest element when it comes to cybersecurity for an organization, right? So here's where we look at, if I can eliminate the human element some and basically create these repetitive processes, I know that every time I run that script, it's going to do the exact same set of commands. I don't have to worry about there all of a sudden being a typo one day, because that file shouldn't really change over time unless I'm purposely making new versions of it. But when that script runs, it's going to automate whatever tasks I have it automate, and I don't have to worry about there being an error just all of a sudden out of the blue. It's typically going to be a human error that gets introduced into that particular scenario. So we want to look at various different things with automation using things like APIs. We look at things like guardrails and how we're going to allow people to do certain things, or maybe even allow certain resources to perform certain tasks within the organization's infrastructure. So subdomain 4.8, explain appropriate incident response activities. So we don't want to figure out how to respond to a disaster or to some sort of an incident like someone trying to attack the organization when that event is actually occurring. We want to plan for these things ahead of time. And so we'll talk about some of the different processes that go along with that, things like chain of custody and acquisition of that data, preservation, e-discovery, some of the legal things that we need to be aware of when it comes to preparing for and actually performing those steps. As far as subdomains 4.9, given a scenario, use data sources to support an investigation. So we'll take a look at various different types of log files and what those log files can do. We'll talk about log file retention and perhaps cycling through log files, because we may not necessarily need to keep a log file forever, but we do want to keep it for at least a certain amount of time until we're sure that we no longer need that log anymore. So let's go ahead and move into domain 5.0. This is going to be our security program management and oversight. So starting off with subdomain 5.1, we want to look at being able to summarize elements of effective security governance. So again, we'll talk more about things like the acceptable usage policy, perhaps things like NDAs might also fall under those policies, a non-disclosure agreement, SDLC, or software development lifecycle. There's all sorts of different policies, password policies that may fall under this. We'll talk about other types of governance and perhaps groups within the organization, perhaps boards or committees that are going to help kind of regulate some of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. Maybe things like a change control board or a change advisory board might fall under those. We'll also talk about onboarding and offboarding some more, as well as various different external considerations such as, again, government laws and policies and whatnot, whether we're talking about here in the U.S. with, HIPAA or GLBA, or, if you're doing SOX auditing for the Sarbanes-Oxley Act requirements for your company. If you're in Europe, there might be GDPR. So there's a lot of different things that you need to be familiar with, even from a global perspective when it comes to external considerations to how we operate. Subdomain 5.2, we want to explain elements of the risk management process. So again, if you've got a background in project management, these should come pretty easy to you. There's a lot of overlap with the project management world when it comes to analyzing and handling risks. So here we'll talk about things like RTO, RPO, MTTR, and MTBF. That's our recovery time objective, recovery point objective, mean time to repair, and mean time between failures. All really important things that we need to be aware of when we're keeping track of how long these systems are going to run potentially before we can expect a failure, and how long can they be down when they do fail. You also may have to do a little bit of math. If somebody told you there was going to be no math on this exam, well, I'm not saying you will, but you might have to calculate things with like our annual rate of occurrence or the annualized loss expectancy or single loss expectancy. They could put those numbers in any sort of format where you might have to calculate one given the other two. So make sure that you're familiar with what those are, as well as what is a qualitative analysis versus a quantitative analysis, and how do we analyze these risks, how do we identify them, and then what kind of treatment are we going to use for them? Are we simply going to absorb that risk and say, you know what, I'm just going to have to take that risk, or are we going to put into place certain kind of controls to mitigate those risks over time? Moving into subdomain 5.3, explain the processes associated with third-party risk assessment and management. Here we'll talk about more types of agreements, such as a service level agreement or non-disclosure agreements or a business partnership agreement or a memorandum of understanding. So there's a lot of different things from a business process perspective that you need to be familiar with here as well. We also then have subdomain 5.4, summarizing elements of effective security compliance, where we get into, again, things that are perhaps legal consequences if we're not doing certain things correctly. We might get into things that are geographical restrictions, such as GDPR for Europe or HIPAA for here in the United States, or GLBA or FINRA or FISMA or whatever else, right? There's a lot of different laws that we have to make sure that we are adhering to, and some of those you might have to check with your legal department for as well. Moving into subdomain 5.5, explaining types and purposes of audits and assessments. So here we're going to get into things like penetration testing, also known as pen testing for short. There's a lot of different types of penetration testing out there, but essentially this is typically where we're going to hire a third party to try and exploit some of those vulnerabilities that might exist in the organization. We've gone through and we've patched and we've mitigated as many of those as we possibly could, but now we want to put it to the test. We want to put our team to the test and make sure that they can actually stop these attacks in process, or make sure that we can prevent someone from getting to certain types of information. So let's go ahead and move into subdomain 5.6. Given a scenario, implement security awareness practices, and this is where we said humans are our weakest link in the organization, which means that we need to train them. We need to make sure that they are aware of the various different attack vectors and threats that are out there, so they know what to look for, so that someone can't just use some social engineering and trick them into giving out their password or any sort of confidential or insider type information, or let someone into an area of the building that perhaps they shouldn't be in. So that is pretty much it for the domains and subdomains. Now, I mentioned that there's a lot of TLAs that you guys might want to be familiar with. If you're not familiar with the term TLA, those are our three-letter acronyms. Again, kind of a running joke in IT. We've got a lot of acronyms. So they do have these at the end of this objectives document as well, which I mentioned, again, you can get directly from CompTIA's website. So if you want a good list of acronyms to come through and study, be sure to check these out. Remember, I do still have that tip I said to watch till the end of the video for, so it's coming up here in just a moment, but these are some of the acronyms that you may want to be familiar with. Again, there's page after page after page of acronyms here, so I know that it's a lot, but some of the questions may actually have answers that are only acronyms. So A, B, C, D, are all going to be an acronym, or it might have acronyms as part of the question that you need to make sure that you understand what they're asking for. Okay, so that brings me to the tip that I said to watch till the end of the video for, because this is something that a lot of people don't know. So if we scroll all the way back up here to the very top of the document, before you even get into the test details here, the very last paragraph before you get into the details, there's a little note here. So I want you to read that note. So I've gone ahead and zoomed in here a little bit so you guys can read that a little better. So please note, the lists of examples provided in bulleted format are not exhaustive lists. Other examples of technologies, processes, or tasks pertaining to each objective may also be included on the exam, although not listed or covered in this objectives document. Did you hear that? Other examples of technologies, processes, or tasks pertaining to each objective may also be included on the exam, although not listed or covered in this objectives document. So be sure that you are looking at everything in this document, but if you see something on your exam that was not in here, that's because CompTIA reserves the right to basically put anything that they feel is relevant into this exam. So be sure that you are looking at all the various different resources that you can when you're studying for this material. That's why if you go through some of my practice questions, if you happen to see things that are not in the objectives, that might be why. Because I try and cover things more than just that, knowing that at some point they might decide to put some of that information in there, and it's still very relevant to the Security Plus concepts that you should be familiar with. So CompTIA is constantly reviewing the content of our exams and updating test questions to be sure our exams are current and the security of the questions is protected. In other words, making sure people don't cheat and memorize these questions or somehow take a screenshot or record it or whatever and release them out to the public. So as well, avoid all those exam dumps, the brain dumps and whatever. A lot of them have wrong answers anyways, so you're really doing yourself a disservice if you don't actually learn this information. But when necessary, we will publish updated exams based on existing exam objectives. Please note that all related exam preparation materials will still be valid. And that's where I was saying, even using some of the materials from 601 and 501 and 401 even, a lot of that stuff hasn't changed. There's really not a difference between asymmetric and symmetric encryption from 4 exams ago versus today. The concepts there are still the same. A digital signature, where we're basically encrypting the hash and then decrypting that hash, that concept hasn't changed. So some of the older materials are still going to be valid for preparing for this SY0-701 exam. So I hope you found this special tip helpful. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave those down in the comments box down below. I'm happy to answer anything that I can. If you're interested in the class, certainly feel free to reach out anytime. As I asked earlier, if you would, please like and subscribe to this video. It helps me with the algorithm, but it also helps to make sure that you see more content just like this. Be sure to check out the rest of the links in the description down below as well. I'll be working on some more videos here soon, but until then, I wish you guys the best of luck if you're taking this exam soon. You guys take care, and we'll see you soon.